So let's talk about like what's really causing histamine intolerance.
Yeah, so there are a lot of potential causes. Off the bat, we want to be looking at diet, of course.
Right.
If you're eating a high histamine diet, so histamine is found in a variety of like aged foods and fermented foods, and it's kind of the way that these proteins break down, it increases the amount of histamine that you're going to find in those foods. For people that don't have histamine intolerance, that's not a problem. But for people who are having issues processing that excess histamine, we're going to want to go on a low histamine diet. So avoiding things like yogurt, kefir, even kombucha, which like we think as being really healthy.
Yep.
We want to avoid any kind of like aged meats, so like deli meats or hot dogs. And then even when we're getting, our grass-fed beef and, our high quality beef, we want to make sure that we're getting it as close as we can from like the time of slaughter, because it contains histamine in it. And then the longer that it sits in your fridge or what have you in travel time, those histamine levels increase. So that even counts when we're talking about having leftovers inside your fridge. If you've prepared some meat on Monday, it's going to have a lot more histamine in it come Wednesday or Thursday.
Right.
Fermented vegetables too, we're thought of as like those heal the gut, but that can be a nightmare for someone with histamine problems.
For sure.
And alcohol is another big one. So not only does alcohol contain a lot of histamine, but it prevents your body from producing the diamine oxidase, the DAO enzyme, which is one of the top enzymes that helps break down excess histamine in the body. So those are, kind of the well-known foods that are high in histamine. But then we also have other things like just stress in general. If you are, like I used to be very type A, very much a go-getter and burning the candle at both ends, you're going to be producing more histamine.
Right.
If you're not getting enough sleep, sleep is the foundation to, anytime we're talking about health in the body, that's going to increase histamine problems. And then there are some, I call them like sneaky causes. So I tend to notice, the women that I work with, they either have a history of one of these or all three of these. And it's, excessive antibiotic use, birth control pills, and ibuprofen or NSAIDs. And it's really the way that those three things affect the gut microbiome, and they start turning the immune system from a Th1 state to a Th2 state. So when we're in that Th2 state, it's like this overactivation of the immune system. That's when we see all these autoimmune diseases. So I tend to see a pretty big history of those things. And then there are also like gut infections. So what's the state of your gut like? Do you have yeast overgrowth or C. difficile, SIBO? We make that DAO enzyme inside the small intestine of our gut primarily. So if you have a bunch of harmful bacteria there, you're not going to be able to produce that diamine oxidase enzyme enough. And now we're going to get this overflow of histamine. Parasites are another big cause. I find that parasites and mold overgrowth are the two top causes. And why that is, parasites essentially hijack the immune system. They cause a release of histamine, formaldehyde, and ammonia in your body, which causes your mast cells to release even more histamine. They're absorbing your nutrients. So very insidious. And the same thing for mold. We're either eating mold on our food and things like corn and peanuts, grains and legumes, or you're exposed to it inside your home. You can be exposed to it inside your car. I didn't know it, but I was breathing it in from sleeping next to a window unit air conditioner for several years. For sure. So that's a big source of mold. Even like hotel rooms, like you have to be really careful about this stuff. People really don't suspect mold. And the thing is you don't have to see it in order to know that you've been exposed to it.
Right.
And it's one of those things where some people are able to live in a house full of mold and they don't get symptoms. But then we have those women that are like canaries in the coal mine, and it's a blessing because really symptoms are a blessing at the end of the day. It's our body's way of communicating with us that it needs help. But those are the women who, have those excessive histamine problems, and it's from that mold. And really the only way that we can get mold out of the body is doing the right protocols and using the right binders doing the liver support, the gut support. So that's a handful of kind of the most common causes of histamine intolerance. And that's why it's so important to do a really thorough intake and really figure out what labs we need to do in order to figure out which of these root causes are, why you're experiencing your symptoms.
Absolutely. It makes me think of when we used to live in the condo, our like air conditioning unit was just kind of like off to the side where our bed was in our bedroom. And it was blowing on us like all the time, nonstop. And then I got these like, I don't even know what they were called, but just got like skin issues. I forget what it's called now. Not like they weren't hives, but they was just like skin discoloration, these little spots. And for the longest time, I was just like, what is going on here? And then sure enough, I was like, oh my God, this is blowing all over the bed, all over our sheets. And then so changed all the sheets, like got rid of that. And we just had to turn it off. We couldn't keep it on in the bedroom. And like it made a huge difference. It was literally blowing all over my skin. So, it's things like that where I was like, I'm looking at everything in my diet. I'm looking like what's causing this. And then it's like right there in front of you. It's so obvious, but kind of not so obvious, right? It's like you said, you have to do a really thorough intake, going to your doctor and just saying you're having these like, quote unquote, allergic reactions and being handed a antihistamine. Like it's not going to solve what's really happening here. So where do people start? Like if they've got all these symptoms showing up and the liver's involved, the gut, nutrition, all of that, like where would somebody start?
Yeah, definitely. So the first places that I start is obviously the diet piece. Eliminating the high histamine food triggers. We might be adding in a DAO enzyme to support breaking down that food grade histamine. And then some people benefit from the natural herbal antihistamines, like quercetin is a really popular one, nettles, butterbur. But for the people that are having like really severe histamine problems, those types of things might not help.
Right.
But it's definitely a place that I like to start. And then also looking at personal care products. So, anything that we put on our skin is our largest organ. We're going to be absorbing it all. And then our liver has to process that in 15 minutes. So we want to, take the burden off of the liver as much as we can. So making sure we're not using endocrine disruptors, no fragrances, no fluoride in a toothpaste, checking off all of those boxes and eliminating that toxic exposure that way. We want to make sure that we're trying to optimize sleep. So I get people on magnesium. Some women I notice can't tolerate magnesium glycinate is one that I use frequently, but a lot of women, because it's so heavily absorbable, it'll start to cause them some kind of detox symptoms. So sometimes we have to play around with that. And that's why, working with practitioners is so important and, getting quality supplements and kind of understanding how these supplements are working is really important. And then I also like to start with Castor Oil Packs. So I could do, a 30-minute talk on all the benefits of Castor Oil Packs, but especially when we're talking about histamine intolerance, putting that Castor Oil Pack over the liver is going to help just start to give it a little boost. And we're going to start boosting that lymphatic system, which is a challenge often for these women. And it's just a really gentle way to start the detoxification process. For some women, I do recommend, depending on if this is the first time that you're kind of doing any detoxing, we might need to introduce some binders before and after to help mitigate any potential discomfort, because it is normal the first couple of uses. Maybe you're going to notice a little bit of flushing, a little bit of hives, and a little bit of itching. It's because we're finally pushing that histamine out of the body.
Totally.
So I love, working on all of those things while we're waiting for test results to come back, and just kind of starting to check things off little bits one by one.
Perfect. Yeah, I absolutely love Castor Oil Packs. And I often find if I use it at night, it's very calming. There's something so calming about it, it like puts me to sleep. So I do often leave it on when I go to bed at night. I don't know how you do it. Or sometimes even I'm just sitting here at my desk, like I just use it. There's so many opportunities to use it.
Yeah, definitely. I have clients that like to use it throughout the night. And it's one of those things where, you can't really overdo it. You're overdoing it is if you start to get like loose stools.
Right.
But really the more you do it, the more benefit you're going to get from it.
For sure. Absolutely. Okay, cool. So you mentioned labs and doing some testing. what would that look like?
Yeah, so there's really, like, if we were really wanting to see like low levels of histamine in your body, that testing can be really expensive and it's very difficult because it's like you have to go to the lab when you're having a reaction and like get a blood draw, and it's really complicated. So, rather than doing that, where we can really just kind of look at your symptoms and history and be like, you obviously have histamine problems, let's look for those root causes. So, we're definitely going to be checking gut health, potentially with an organic acid test and or a GI map test, which is going to show us, do you have that SIBO? Do we see any parasites? It has different markers of mold, mitochondrial function. And then more often than not, I'm almost always wanting to run a mycotoxin test because mycotoxins are just so much associated with histamine problems. And people really underestimate this. And then, it really depends on the types of mold that you have in your body. It's going to dictate the type of treatment and the type of binders that we want. So we really want to get that information. And then, if you're dealing with estrogen dominance, which is a very common problem to have overlapping with the histamine problem.
Right.
I know that was me, and I totally did not understand when I was experiencing it why I was having worse histamine throughout different points of my cycle. And it's, when estrogen is high in our cycle, that's when the body can produce more histamine, and vice versa. When we have too much histamine, it can produce more estrogen. So it's like this terrible positive feedback cycle. So we want to check for that estrogen dominance using a Dutch test. That's going to show us the breakdown of those 3 different types of estrogen. What's your progesterone look like? Progesterone actually helps our body produce more of that Dow enzyme. So we want to optimize our hormones in that way. So those are kind of like the baseline tests. And then it might just depend on, do we know that you also had a lot of dental work and you have silver fillings?
For sure.
We're going to check for things like heavy metals, as well as like maybe you've been exposed to a lot of chemicals. We're going to run like a Great Plains tox test where it's looking at a wide variety of different toxins, glyphosate, that kind of thing. So it's definitely person specific, but at a minimum, we want to do the Dutch test, the organic acid test, the mycotoxin test, and then potentially also the GI map.
Awesome. Okay. No, that's a really good overview. So you mentioned estrogen dominance. I'd love to really talk about the connection here between histamine and your hormones, because there's obviously a big role there.
Yeah, definitely. So when we think about a woman's, typical 28, 30-day cycle, we have estrogen that's going to rise at 2 points throughout the cycle. So once, preparing the body for ovulation, and then again, right before we get our period. If you're someone who has estrogen dominance, those estrogen spikes are going to be a lot more significant,
right,
and your progesterone is going to be a lot less. So at these 2 times during your cycle, women tell me this all the time, that like they just have the worst histamine problems during ovulation or right before their period.
Yeah.
And it's because of that estrogen spike. Unfortunately, estrogen and histamine can both be released from mast cells, and they can both bind to mast cells. So when one is high, it triggers the body to release the other one. So that's why, we want to do things to be addressing liver health. Castor oil is one of those. And then also, any kind of estrogen supporting detoxification with, getting high fiber foods. DIM can help. Different herbal blends like dandelion and burdock,
right,
and that kind of those kind of herbal supports can help start detoxifying the liver. But yeah, it can be very frustrating having to deal with those excess histamine problems and not really understanding the connection to the surging estrogen at the different points of your cycle.
For sure. It's so key to track, because then you can be even more conscious about the things you need to avoid, like drinking alcohol or things like that around those specific times in your period. I know that sushi, it's the randomest thing, but like sushi, I used to really react to eating it right around my period. But if I ate it in like early follicular phase, I didn't have this reaction to it. It was really interesting. So just tracking your cycle can really help you be conscious of, when to really be conscious of eliminating certain things.